He's just my husband. That was the moment I decided to end a man's career. The laughter came easy, effortless, like it belonged there, like I didn't. It rolled across the ballroom in soft waves, bouncing off crystal glasses and polished marble floors, blending with the low hum of conversations and the faint clink of silverware. I stood there, a half-finished glass of bourbon in my hand, watching my wife smile like she hadn't just erased me with a single sentence. Emily didn't even look back at me after she said it. She didn't need to. In her world, I was already background noise. Atlas Dynamics' annual executive dinner wasn't the kind of place you accidentally ended up in. Black ties, tailored suits, women in gowns that probably cost more than my first car, and conversations filled with words like equity, expansion, and acquisition. I had been to this event before, more times than I could count, but tonight felt different. Or maybe I was just finally seeing it clearly. Emily stood near the center of the room, her hand lightly resting on Richard Hayes's arm, her boss, the man everyone here treated like he owned the future. He was laughing now, head tilted back, teeth flashing under the warm chandelier light. The kind of laugh that said he was used to winning. And Emily, she matched him. Same rhythm, same confidence, same belief that this room belonged to them. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the burn settle in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. More precise. People around me were still smiling, still pretending the comment had been harmless, just a joke, just corporate humor. But there's a difference between a joke and a statement, and I'd learned a long time ago how to tell which was which. I adjusted my cufflinks, simple silver, nothing flashy, and glanced around the room. The board members were here tonight. Investors too. Faces that most people wouldn't recognize, but I did. I always did. That was the thing about being invisible. You see everything. No one filters themselves around you. No one hides the truth. Emily had started out differently. Years ago, she used to look at me like I was the center of her world, not an afterthought she had to explain away at parties. But success changes people. Or maybe it just reveals who they were always becoming. The promotions, the late nights, the new circles of friends who spoke in numbers instead of names. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being her partner and started becoming her inconvenience. Richard said something then, leaning closer to her, his voice just loud enough for the group to hear. Well, at least he knows his place. More laughter. Louder this time. I watched Emily's expression. Not forced. Not uncomfortable. Genuine. That was the part that settled it for me. I didn't feel a surge of emotion. No dramatic shift, no sudden urge to react. Just clarity. The kind that arrives quietly and doesn't ask for permission. I set my glass down on the nearest table with a soft, deliberate motion. The condensation ring it left behind spread slowly across the white linen like something permanent. Conversations around me continued, unaware, uninterrupted. That was fine. They had no reason to notice. Not yet. I straightened my jacket, feeling the weight of the moment settle into place. 15 years of silence has a way of sharpening your patience. Of teaching you exactly when to speak and when to let people keep talking. Because the longer they talk, the more they reveal. And tonight they had revealed everything I needed. I took a step forward, then another, moving toward the center of the room where Emily and Richard stood surrounded by people who believed they understood power. The lighting caught the edge of her emerald dress as she turned slightly, still smiling, still playing her part. For a brief second, her eyes flicked toward me. Just a glance. Just enough to register that I was moving. And then she looked away. Dismissed. That was her mistake. Not the words. Not the laughter. The assumption. The belief that she already knew who I was, what I was worth, where I belong. I stopped a few feet away from them, close enough now to hear every word clearly, close enough that my presence would no longer go unnoticed. Richard was mid-sentence, talking about expansion into European markets, painting futures he thought he controlled. I let him finish. I let the room settle into that comfortable rhythm again. And then, calmly, evenly, like I was discussing nothing more than the weather, I said. Careful what you say in a room you don't understand. The silence didn't hit all at once. It spread. Slowly. Like a ripple moving outward from a single point. A few heads turned. Then a few more. Emily blinked, her smile faltering just slightly, confusion replacing certainty for the first time that night. Richard's expression tightened, not fear, not yet, but irritation. He wasn't used to being interrupted. Especially not by someone he thought didn't matter. That was fine too. Because in exactly 60 seconds, he was going to learn something most people in this room never do. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. And then it speaks once. Richard let out a short laugh, the kind that was meant to dismiss rather than engage, and took a slow sip of his champagne before looking at me like I had just interrupted something trivial. I think I understand this room just fine, he said, his voice smooth, controlled, practiced from years of boardrooms and negotiations where he always had the upper hand. A few people around him nodded, eager to stay aligned with the man they believed held their future bonuses in his hands. Emily shifted slightly beside him, her fingers tightening around her glass, her posture still confident, but her eyes no longer ignoring me. She was watching now, measuring, trying to decide if this was still harmless or if something had shifted. I could see the calculation begin. It was subtle, but it was there. I had seen that look before, not just in her, but in dozens of rooms just like this one. The moment when confidence starts looking for confirmation. I kept my expression neutral, calm, the same tone I had used for years when I chose not to correct people, when I let assumptions build because it served a purpose. You understand what you have been told, I replied, my voice even, not raised, not rushed. That is not the same thing. The words landed softly, but they did not disappear. Conversations nearby slowed, then stopped entirely as people began to realize something was happening. That did not fit the script of the evening. Richard's smile faded just a fraction, replaced by something sharper. Not fear, not yet. But attention. Real attention. And what exactly do you think I have been told wrong? He asked, setting his glass down with deliberate care, the stem clicking lightly against the table. He was stepping into it now, confident enough to challenge, certain enough that whatever this was, he could control it. That was the advantage he believed he had. That was the advantage he was about to lose. I glanced briefly around the room, taking in the faces that had gathered, the board members standing a little closer now, the investors pausing mid-conversation, the quiet shift in energy as curiosity replaced comfort. This was not a scene anymore. This was becoming a moment. And moments, when handled correctly, change everything. You have been told you run this company, I said, turning my gaze back to him. You have been told your decisions are final, that your authority is absolute, that the people in this room answer to you. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of those assumptions to settle. And for a while, that was almost true. A murmur moved through the crowd, small but noticeable, like the first crack in something people thought was solid. Emily's expression tightened, confusion giving way to something closer to concern. She looked at Richard, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that were starting to collide. Almost? Richard repeated, his voice firmer now, less amused, more controlled. That is a very bold word to use in a room like this. I nodded slightly. It is, I said. But bold does not mean inaccurate. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, not rushed, not dramatic, just a simple motion that drew every eye in the immediate circle. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the servers along the edges of the room seemed to pause, trays balanced, watching. I pulled out a slim, dark folder, the kind that looked ordinary enough to be overlooked, and held it loosely at my side for a moment before placing it gently on the table between us. The sound it made was quiet, but in the silence it carried what most people in this room do not realize, I continued, my voice steady, is that Atlas Dynamics has never operated the way it appears on paper. I let that sit for a second, watching as the confusion deepened, as curiosity sharpened into something more focused. 15 years ago, the ownership structure was changed. I said. Not publicly. Not in a way that would attract attention. But legally, completely, and permanently. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of something real crossing his face for the first time. He did not speak. He was listening now. Carefully. That was new. A blind trust was established. I went on. One that removed direct visibility from day-to-day operations, one that allowed leadership to function without interference, one that ensured the company could grow without being tied to a single name. Emily's breath caught, barely audible, but I heard it. She was starting to understand that this was not a misunderstanding. This was something she had never been told. And the person who controls that trust, I said, resting my hand lightly on the folder, has the authority to override any executive decision made in this company. Immediately. Without appeal. The room had gone completely still now, the kind of stillness that only comes when people realize they are standing at the edge of something they did not expect. Richard's eyes locked onto mine, searching, calculating, trying to find the angle, the weakness, the explanation that would put him back in control. And you expect me to believe that you are connected to that how? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the easy confidence it had carried just minutes ago. I met his gaze without hesitation. I do not expect you to believe anything, I said calmly. I expect you to listen. I opened the folder slowly, not to create drama, but because control is built in small, deliberate movements, and every second mattered now. Inside were a handful of documents, nothing flashy, nothing oversized, just clean, precise pages that carried more weight than any speech I could give. I turned the first page toward Richard, letting him see the header before I said a word. His eyes moved across the text, scanning quickly at first, then slowing, then stopping entirely. That was the moment the confidence cracked. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for, but I did. I had seen men lose control before. It never starts loud. It starts with silence. This is the trust documentation, I said calmly, my voice steady enough to carry but not raised. Filed 15 years ago, amended twice, most recently 18 months back. A few of the people closest to us leaned in, not close enough to invade, but close enough to read the shift in tone, the change in posture, the way Richard's shoulders were no longer relaxed. Emily stepped closer to the table, her eyes moving between the document and my face, trying to process something that did not fit the version of me she had carried for years. That is not possible, Richard said, but there was hesitation now, a fraction of a second too long before the words came out. I have full executive authority. I have signed every major decision in this company for the last decade. I nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that statement without giving it power. You have signed decisions, I said. That does not mean you own them. The distinction landed harder than anything else I had said. Ownership is a word people understand, even when they pretend they do not. I slid the second page forward, tapping it lightly with my finger. Section 8, I said. Override authority. The trustee retains the right to nullify any executive action that conflicts with long-term strategic control. Richard's eyes flicked down again, faster this time, sharper, looking for a flaw, a loophole, something he could push back against. He did not find it. He could not. The room had gone completely still now, not just quiet, but focused, the kind of attention that pulls everything inward. Conversations across the ballroom had faded, replaced by a low tension that spread outward from our table. Emily's voice came out softer than I had ever heard it in a room like this. Daniel, what are you saying? It was not disbelief. It was something closer to realization. I turned my head slightly toward her, meeting her eyes fully for the first time that night. I am saying, I replied, that the version of me you have been introducing to people is incomplete. She held my gaze for a second longer than usual, searching, replaying moments, conversations, decisions that suddenly felt different under this new light. Then I looked back at Richard. You built your authority on visibility, I said. On meetings, signatures, public perception. You believe that because people saw you in charge, you were in control. I let a small pause settle between us. But control does not come from being seen. It comes from what cannot be replaced. Richard's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no quick response, no immediate counter. He was calculating, trying to understand how far this went, how deep the structure ran, how much of what he believed was real. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not when I spoke, not when I placed the folder down, but when he realized he did not have all the information. If what you are implying is true, he said slowly, choosing each word carefully now, then why stay silent for so long? It was the right question. The one that mattered. The one that most people in this room were thinking but would never ask out loud. I allowed myself a small breath before answering, not for effect, but because the truth deserved precision. Because silence is leverage, I said. It lets people show you exactly who they are when they think there are no consequences. I did not look at Emily when I said it, but I felt the shift beside me, the way her posture changed, the way the meaning reached her anyway. And tonight, I continued, you both made that very clear. I closed the folder halfway, not fully, just enough to signal that what needed to be seen had been seen. The difference is, I said, my voice still calm, still measured. Now there are consequences. For a moment, no one spoke, and in a room built on constant noise, that kind of silence felt unnatural, almost heavy, like the air itself had shifted. Richard's fingers rested on the edge of the folder, not gripping it, not pulling it closer, just touching it like it might confirm or deny everything at once. His eyes moved again, scanning the lines he had already read, as if repetition might change their meaning. It did not. Across from him, one of the board members, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for never missing details, stepped forward just enough to see the document more clearly. He did not ask for permission. He did not need to. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read, then he looked up at me, not confused, not surprised, but recognizing something he had suspected without proof. That was the difference. Some people in this room were shocked. Others were adjusting. Emily had not moved. Her glass was still in her hand, untouched, her posture no longer relaxed but not yet broken. She was thinking, replaying every introduction, every time she had minimized me, every quiet dinner where I said nothing while she talked about her world as if I was not part of it. Her voice came again, softer this time, less certain. You never told me. It was not an accusation. It was a realization. I did not look at her right away. Instead, I watched Richard because his reaction mattered first. He finally lifted his gaze from the folder, meeting my eyes directly, and this time there was no performance in his expression. No charm. No practiced confidence. Just calculation trying to recover lost ground. If this structure exists, he said carefully, then it should have been disclosed to the executive board. There it was. The attempt to reframe. To pull the conversation back into rules he understood. I gave a small nod, acknowledging the logic without conceding anything. It was disclosed, I said. At the level required. Not at the level assumed. A few heads turned at that, subtle but noticeable. Assumptions were starting to feel dangerous now. The silver-haired board member straightened slightly and cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension with quiet authority. There was a clause, he said slowly, as if confirming it to himself as much as anyone else. A long-term control provision. We were told it existed, but not who held it. He looked at me again, this time with something closer to respect. Most of us assumed it was institutional. I met his gaze briefly. That was the intention. The room absorbed that in silence. Institutional control meant stability. It meant no single person could disrupt the structure. It meant safety. Until now. Richard exhaled slowly, a controlled release, but it did not fully hide the shift in his posture. He was no longer leading this conversation. He was reacting to it. And you expect us to believe, he said, choosing his words with more care than before, that you have just decided to reveal this, tonight? I tilted my head slightly, considering the phrasing. Not just tonight, I replied. I decided to reveal it when it became necessary. Another small pause. Tonight is when it became unavoidable. Emily's hand lowered slightly, the glass hovering near the table now, her attention fully on me. Unavoidable because of what? She asked. There was no edge in her voice anymore. Just uncertainty. I finally turned to her, holding her gaze long enough for the meaning to settle. Because respect is not something you negotiate after it is gone, I said quietly. You either recognize it, or you learn what it costs to ignore it. She looked like she wanted to respond, but nothing came. Words require certainty, and she did not have that anymore. I shifted my attention back to Richard because the next part was not about understanding. It was about action. Over the last 6 months, I said, my tone returning to precise and controlled, there have been a series of decisions made under your leadership that conflict directly with the Trust's long-term directives. His expression hardened slightly, defensive now, searching for footing. Every decision I made was approved, he said. Every expansion, every restructuring, every... I raised my hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to stop the momentum. He did. Approved within the scope you believed you had, I said. Not within the authority that actually exists. I opened the folder again, turning to a different section, sliding a second set of documents forward. These are internal audit reports, I continued. Prepared independently. Not circulated through your office. The words landed. Differently this time. Not theoretical. Not structural. Specific. Real. The silver-haired board member leaned in again, and this time others followed, drawn by the shift from possibility to evidence. Richard's jaw tightened once more, but now there was something else beneath it. Not just resistance. Pressure. What exactly are you implying? He asked, his voice lower, more controlled than before, but no longer fully steady. I held his gaze, letting the answer sit between us for a second before I gave it to him. I am not implying anything, I said calmly. I am stating that effective immediately, your authority is under review. The words settled into the room like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not need repetition. For a second, Richard did not move, as if his body had not yet caught up to what his mind was processing. Then his lips pressed into a thin line, and he straightened slightly, pulling himself back into the version of control he had relied on for years. Under review? He repeated, the phrase coming out slower, more deliberate, as if saying it differently might change its weight. You cannot walk into a formal company event and suspend executive authority based on documents no one here has verified. It was a good attempt. Not aggressive. Not defensive. Strategic. The kind of response that buys time. I let him have the sentence. Then I nodded once. You are right, I said. Verification matters. I reached into my jacket again, this time pulling out my phone, not hurried, not dramatic, just another measured movement. A few people shifted closer, drawn and not by curiosity anymore, but by the realization that this was moving beyond theory. I tapped the screen once, then turned it slightly so both Richard and the board members nearest him could see. That is why verification was completed before tonight, I said calmly. On the screen was a confirmation email chain, timestamps, legal headers, signatures that carried more weight than any conversation in that room. The subject line alone was enough to change the temperature. Immediate oversight activation. Richard's eyes flicked across the screen, faster this time. Absorbing, recalculating, looking for something he could challenge. There was nothing to challenge. These were sent at 3:42 this afternoon. I continued, my tone unchanged. To the board, to legal counsel, and to the trust external administrators. The silver-haired board member nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. He had seen it. He had read it. That was all it took. Around us, the room shifted again, this time more noticeably. Conversations were no longer paused. They were gone. People were watching openly now, no longer pretending this was a private exchange. Emily set her glass down on the table with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Her hands were free now, but she did not know what to do with them. She looked at me, then at the phone, then at Richard, as if trying to anchor herself to something that still made sense. "Daniel," she said again, but this time my name carried something new. Not dismissal. Not certainty. Something closer to disbelief. I did not respond to her. Not yet. This part was not about reassurance. It was about clarity. Richard exhaled slowly, then nodded once, as if accepting a reality he could no longer deny but was not ready to concede. "Even if that is valid," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, "a review does not mean removal. You do not have grounds to make that leap." He was narrowing the frame, trying to contain the damage. That was expected. I slid the second set of documents closer to him, tapping lightly on the top page. "That depends on what the review finds," I said. "And in this case, the findings are already documented." He did not reach for the papers immediately. That hesitation said more than any reaction could. Finally, he picked them up, scanning quickly, then slower, his expression tightening with each line. Numbers. Dates. Internal transfers. Authorization trails that did not align cleanly. Not illegal. Not dramatic. But inconsistent in ways that mattered when someone was watching closely. "These are preliminary," he said, but the confidence was thinner now, stretched. "Preliminary does not mean inaccurate," I replied. "It means confirmed enough to act." The silver-haired board member spoke again, his voice steady, carrying authority without needing volume. "If these reports are substantiated," he said, looking at Richard, "then we are obligated to proceed with immediate oversight measures." He paused, then added, "That includes temporary suspension of executive decision-making." There it was. Not my words. Not my authority alone. Institutional weight. That was what Richard had been relying on. And now it was shifting away from him. Emily's eyes widened slightly, the realization finally catching up fully. This was no longer a conversation she could smooth over, no longer a moment that could be laughed off. This was real. This was consequence. Richard looked at the board member, then back at me, his expression tightening into something sharper, something closer to controlled frustration. "You planned this," he said quietly. Not an accusation. A recognition. I met his gaze evenly. "I prepared for it," I said. "There is a difference." The room held that exchange in silence. No laughter. No background noise. Just the quiet understanding that something had shifted permanently. I closed the folder fully this time, the soft click echoing in the stillness. "Effective immediately," I said, my voice calm, steady, unchanged from the moment I spoke my first word. "Your executive authority is suspended pending full review." No one reacted immediately, and that was the clearest sign that everything had already changed. In a room where people were used to quick responses, confident reactions, and immediate alignment with power, the hesitation now was not uncertainty. It was recalibration. People were adjusting to a new center of gravity, and they were doing it in real time. Richard did not speak again right away. He stood there, the documents still in his hand, but his grip had loosened, like they no longer felt like tools he could use, but evidence he could not ignore. His eyes moved across the room, not searching for support, but measuring distance. Who was still with him? Who was already stepping away? It was subtle, but I saw it. The slight shift of a shoulder, the half-step backward from one of his closest executives, the way a conversation behind him quietly dissolved instead of stepping in. Power does not disappear all at once. It thins out. Emily took a small step toward me, not fully, not decisively, but enough that the movement itself said more than anything she could have spoken. Her voice came out carefully, like she was choosing each word with a precision she had never needed before. "Daniel, this does not have to happen like this." I let the sentence settle for a moment before I answered, not because I needed time, but because she needed to hear the silence first. "It already happened like this," I said quietly. She shook her head slightly, her composure still intact, but fragile now, like something held together by habit rather than certainty. "We can fix this," she continued, lowering her voice just enough that it felt private, even though everyone around us was still listening. "You can handle this differently. Not here. Not in front of everyone." There it was. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement. A request for containment. For control over how the consequences looked. I met her eyes steady, unchanged. "You were comfortable with the audience a few minutes ago," I said. "This is the same room." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time that night, she did not have an answer ready. I turned my attention back to Richard, because the next move mattered more than anything said between us. He had gone quiet, but not passive. There was still calculation in his expression, still an attempt to find a path forward that did not end with him losing everything he had built his identity around. "Temporary suspension," he said finally, his voice controlled again, but tighter, more contained. "That is what you said. Pending review?" I nodded once. "Correct." He exhaled slowly, then adjusted his jacket, a small, habitual gesture that looked normal to anyone not paying attention, but to me it was the reset. The attempt to step back into structure. "Then I expect that review to follow proper procedure," he said. "Formal board involvement. Legal representation. Full transparency." He was negotiating now. Not from strength. From necessity. I inclined my head. Slightly. "It will," I said. "Every step of it." Another pause settled between us, but this one felt different. Less volatile. More defined. The uncertainty had passed. What remained was process. And process is where outcomes become permanent. The silver-haired board member stepped forward again, this time more decisively, his presence no longer observational, but active. "We will convene a formal session within 24 hours," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Until then, all executive decisions are frozen." He looked directly at Richard. "That includes you." The finality in his tone did not need emphasis. It was understood. Around us, the room began to breathe again, but not in the same way it had before. Conversations resumed in low tones, careful, measured, like people were aware they were standing inside something that would be talked about long after tonight. Emily stepped back slightly now, creating a small distance between us, not because she wanted to, but because she did not know where she stood anymore. That was new for her. Uncertainty in a space she used to control. I picked up my glass again, the bourbon now slightly diluted from melted ice, and took a small sip. The taste was different this time. Not because the drink had changed, but because the moment had. Richard set the documents back on the table with controlled precision, not dropping them, not pushing them away, just releasing them. "This is not over," he said quietly, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. I met his gaze without hesitation. "No," I replied. "It is not." Another brief silence passed, but there was no tension left in it. Just acknowledgement. The kind that comes when both sides understand exactly where things stand. I set my glass down once more, straightened my jacket, and took a small step back, not retreating, just resetting the space. "For now," I said, my voice steady, unchanged from the beginning. "We are done here." And for the first time that night, no one laughed. The room did not return to what it had been before, not really, even as conversations slowly restarted and glasses were lifted again with careful hands. There was a difference now, something. Quieter, more aware, like everyone present understood they had just witnessed a line being redrawn. I stepped away from the table without urgency, moving through the space like I had every right to be there, because now no one questioned that anymore. A few people nodded as I passed, not exaggerated, not performative, just small acknowledgments that did not exist 30 minutes earlier. That was how perception shifts. Not with announcements, but with recognition. Behind me, I could hear low voices gathering around Richard, not confrontational, not yet, but close enough to signal that his space was no longer his alone. Oversight had already begun, even without a formal room or a scheduled meeting. It always does. Emily's footsteps followed a second later, quicker than mine, but hesitant in a way I had never heard before. "Daniel, wait," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of the confidence she carried so easily in public. I stopped, not because I had to, but because I chose to, and turned slightly to face her. She was standing closer than before, but not close enough to reach, like she was unsure where the boundary was now. That uncertainty was new for her. "You cannot just walk away from this," she said. There was urgency in her tone, but also something else, something that sounded like she was trying to hold on to a version of reality that no longer fit. I studied her for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment, just with a kind of clarity that comes when you finally see something without filters. "I am not walking away," I said calmly. "I am stepping out of a conversation that already ended." She shook her head again, a small, reflexive motion. "That is not what I mean," she said. Everything that just happened, you could have told me. You should have told me." The words hung between us, but they did not carry the weight she thought they would. I let them sit there for a second before I answered. "What would that have changed?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, just long enough to show she had not expected the question. I would not have said what I said," she replied, her voice softer now, almost defensive. I nodded. "Slightly." "Exactly," I said. "You would have adjusted your behavior based on what you thought I was." I held her gaze steady. "Not based on who I actually am." She looked at me like she wanted to argue, like there was still a version of this she could fix, but the certainty was gone. In its place was something less stable, something searching for ground. "That is not fair," she said finally. "You kept this from me." I exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of understanding. "I kept my position private," I said. "I did not hide my character." The distinction landed, even if she did not want it to. Around us, people were still watching, not openly anymore, but in glances, in the way conversations slowed when we spoke, and the way silence returned in small pockets around us. "This is still our life," she said, her voice tightening slightly, reaching for something that still connected us. "You cannot just separate it like it does not matter." I tilted my head slightly, considering that. "Our life," I repeated, then gave a small nod. "You are right. It is." A brief pause settled between us, not uncomfortable, just honest. "And tonight showed me exactly what that life looks like from your side." She swallowed slightly, her composure holding, but just barely. "So what happens now?" she asked. It was not a challenge. It was a question she did not know the answer to. I glanced past her for a moment, toward the table where Richard stood, now surrounded by people who were no longer laughing, no longer following, but evaluating. Then I looked back at her. "No," I said calmly. "Everything continues exactly the way it needs to." She frowned slightly, not understanding. "What does that mean?" I met her eyes one last time, steady, clear. "It means the review happens," I said. "The truth comes out. And people take responsibility for the roles they chose to play." I let that settle before adding quietly, "Including us." She did not respond. There was nothing left to say that would change what had already been revealed. I gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just final enough to mark the end of the moment, then turned and continued walking, leaving her standing there in a room that no longer felt the same to either of us. And for the first time in a long time, I was not being followed. I did not leave the building right away, not because I needed to stay, but because timing matters, and the difference between walking away and closing a chapter is often measured in minutes, not miles. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter, the thick carpet absorbing the sound of footsteps, the lighting softer, less performative than the glitter behind those doors. I stood there for a moment, adjusting my cufflinks again, a habit more than a necessity, and let the noise from inside fade into something distant. My phone vibrated once in my hand. Then again. I did not need to look to know what it was. The review process had already started moving faster than most people expected. It always does when the right people are involved. I glanced down anyway. 3 new messages. One from legal. One from the trust administrators. One from the silver-haired board member. Short. Direct. Confirmations, not questions. That told me everything I needed to know. I typed a single response to each, nothing long, nothing emotional, just acknowledgement. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Footsteps echoed faintly behind me, and I did not have to turn to know who it was. Emily stopped a few feet away this time, not trying to close the distance anymore, not trying to control the space between us. That alone said more than anything she had said all night. "They are already talking," she said quietly, her voice no longer sharp, no longer confident, just aware. I nodded once. "They should be." She hesitated, then took a slow breath, like she was choosing a different approach, something she had not needed before. "Is it as bad as it looks?" she asked. There was no defense in the question this time. Just uncertainty. I considered it for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because how you say something matters as much as what you say. "It depends on what you mean by bad," I replied. "From a business perspective, this is correction. From a personal one, it is consequence." She absorbed that, her gaze dropping briefly before lifting. Again. "And Richard?" she asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I glanced back toward the ballroom doors, where faint movement and low voices signaled that the center of attention had shifted entirely away from where it started. "Richard built his position on visibility," I said finally. "He will have to defend it with substance." She frowned slightly. "And if he cannot?" I met her eyes again, steady, unchanged. "Then the outcome will match the reality." She exhaled slowly, a quiet release of something she had been holding on to all evening. "I did not know," she said. The sentence was simple, but it carried weight now. Not as an excuse. As a realization. I nodded once. "That much is clear." She looked at me like she wanted to say more, like there were things she could still fix if she chose the right words, but the space for that had already narrowed. "You really would have let all of this continue," she said, almost to herself, "if tonight had not happened?" I did not deny it. "Yes," I said. "Because nothing forces truth to surface faster than assumption." She looked away for a moment, processing that, then back at me. "And me?" she asked. "Where do I fit into that?" The question lingered between us, more personal than anything she had asked before, and for the first time, I took a slightly longer pause before answering. Not because I needed to think, but because I wanted the answer to land exactly where it needed to. "You were part of the environment," I said. "Not the cause, not the system, but a reflection of what it rewarded." She flinched slightly, not visibly to anyone else, but I saw it. "That is a cold way to put it," she said. I gave a small nod. "It is an accurate one." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was clear. The kind of silence that does not ask to be filled because it already contains everything that needs to be understood. Inside the ballroom, a ripple of movement passed again, more pronounced this time, voices rising just enough to signal that decisions were no longer theoretical. The process was no longer beginning. It was underway. Emily glanced back toward the doors, then back at me. "So this is it," she said quietly. I followed her gaze for a brief second before returning it to her. "No," I replied. "This is just the part where everything becomes visible." She held that for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement. Not acceptance. Just acknowledgement. I adjusted my jacket once more, then stepped past her, not brushing against her, not forcing distance, just moving forward with the same steady pace I had maintained all night. And this time, she did not try to stop me. I stepped out into the night air just as the glass doors closed quietly behind me, sealing off the noise, the tension, and the version of the evening that no longer belonged to me. The city stretched out in front of the hotel, lights reflecting off polished cars and distant windows, the steady rhythm of traffic carrying on like nothing had changed. That is the thing about moments like this. They feel enormous when you are inside them, but the world does not pause to acknowledge them. It simply moves forward. I adjusted my jacket one last time, more out of habit than necessity, and took a slow breath, letting the cooler air settle in. My phone vibrated again, more insistently this time. I did not check it right away. I already knew what it would say. Confirmation. Escalation. The formal language of systems doing exactly what they were designed to do. After a few seconds, I reached into my pocket and glanced down. The messages were exactly what I expected. The board had initiated the emergency session. Legal had flagged multiple inconsistencies requiring immediate review. The trust administrators had acknowledged full activation of oversight authority. It was no longer a question of what might happen. It was a matter of how quickly it would unfold. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. There was nothing left to direct. Everything was already in motion. Behind me, through the glass, I could still see fragments of movement, silhouettes shifting, clusters forming and breaking apart as people aligned themselves with the reality that had replaced the one they walked in with. Richard was still there, I could tell even without focusing, surrounded now not by admiration, but by scrutiny. That was the part most people never prepare for. The moment when attention stops being an advantage and starts becoming pressure. I did not feel satisfaction. Not the kind people expect, at least. No surge of victory, no dramatic sense of closure. Just a quiet certainty that things had reached the point they were always going to reach. It had simply taken time for everything to line up. Emily did not come outside. I knew she would not. Not tonight. There are moments when people need space, not distance, but space to understand what just shifted and what it means for everything that comes after. Tonight was that moment for her. I walked down the steps slowly, each one measured, not rushed, not delayed, just steady. The valet glanced up as I approached, his expression neutral but curious, like he had sensed something unusual without knowing what it was. "Evening, sir," he said, reaching for the ticket I handed him. "Your car will be right up." I nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and waited. The city noise filled the silence, distant horns, the low hum of engines, the kind of background sound that keeps everything grounded. A few minutes later, my car pulled up, smooth and quiet, the driver stepping out to open the door. I paused for just a second before getting in, not looking back at the building, not because I was avoiding it, but because I did not need to. I already knew what was happening inside. I slid into the seat, the door closing softly behind me, and the outside world became muted, contained. As the car pulled away from the curb, I leaned back slightly, letting the movement carry me forward. The night stretched ahead, open, uninterrupted. For a long time, I had allowed people to define the space I occupied, to fill in the gaps of what they did not understand with assumptions that made them comfortable. Tonight that ended. Not with an argument. Not with a scene. Just with clarity. My phone buzzed one last time, and this time I glanced at it without hesitation. A short message from the board. Effective immediately, Richard Hayes is relieved of all executive responsibilities pending full investigation. Formal notice to follow. I read it once, then locked the screen. No reaction. No expression. Just acknowledgement. I placed the phone beside me and looked out the window as the city lights passed in steady lines, reflections shifting across the glass. Some people think power is about control, about visibility, about being the loudest voice in the room. It is not. Power is about understanding when to speak, when to wait, and when to let people reveal exactly who they are without interference. Because once they do, the outcome is no longer something you have to force. It becomes something you simply allow. And as the car disappeared into the flow of the city, one thing was clearer than it had ever been. You do not lose respect in a single moment. You reveal that it was never there to begin with.